Welcome to Popcorn Therapy, where the stories we love tell us something about who we are. I am Julie Peters, and the story that we're going to be exploring today is a little bit different from what we normally do. This is the concept of Pedro Pascal, the phenomenon of Pedro Pascal. I had a really wonderful conversation with Jeremy Johnston-Kaye about this concept, and we got into a lot of really interesting topics, including a feminist exploration of parenting from both of our perspectives. And when I was editing this episode, I was having trouble figuring out how to, because we talked for quite a long time, and I felt like the whole conversation was really valuable, but I needed to compress it down a little bit. So what I've done is I've separated it out into two conversations. So what you're about to hear is really focused on Pedro Pascal, the narrative of him as the internet's daddy, the internet's boyfriend, among other things. And the big conversation that we had about parenting from a feminist perspective, I separated out into a bonus episode that I'm going to be sharing in about a week or so. So that being said, please enjoy this conversation with me and Jeremy Johnston-Kaye. Here we go. All right, welcome back everybody to Popcorn Therapy, where the stories that we love tell us something about who we are. And today the story that we're going to be exploring is Pedro Pascal, the concept. And I have a special guest with me today, Jeremy Johnston-Kaye, who is an old friend who we were trying to figure out how long it's been since we've seen each other. It's like, it might be 20 years.
It might be 20 years. If we haven't been to like a common friend wedding, I think that it's probably like 2005 or something like that since we last hung out in person.
You know, we've had like little Instagram chats that have been really interesting about parenthood and gender and stuff like that. And so we were having a conversation that it was just pulling up so many interesting things that I really wanted to have Jeremy come on and just share some of his views about this stuff as well. So thank you so much, Jeremy, for being here. I really appreciate it.
This is awesome.
Yeah, so how would you like to introduce yourself?
I mean, like my professional work is I'm a political and labor communicator. That's what I do as a profession, but my background is psychology and political economy are kind of the twin threads of where I come from. And so like that very much informs the way that I see things, sort of at least from an academic lens. And so that's sort of all I think folks really need to know is by way of an introduction.
And you're a dad.
And I'm a dad. I've got two kids, 12-year-old boy, 6-year-old girl. Figuring that out, we're very much on the cusp of that transition to teenagehood, which I think is very salient to the conversation that we're going to have, and just how like scary sometimes that can feel in you know the world that we are currently living in.
You know, and I think that the conversations that you and I have had have partly been interesting because you're someone that really thinks about what it means to be a parent, what it means to raise a child, like in patriarchy, in capitalism, in white supremacy, you know, in all of these systems that we're slotted into and that we exist within, you know, every day. How is that going to affect our children and the day-to-day choices that we make? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, you know, as most of you probably know listening, I'm a counseling therapist, and I have a special interest actually in working with men. I used to work with a group in Vancouver called Manology, 21st Century Masculinity, led by the wonderful David Hatfield. And we would have these really open conversations about masculinity with men. And that's just not an environment that I had been in before. Like it was sort of news to me to be in a space where men could really openly talk about their feelings and experiences and stuff like that. And I've been wanting to explore these concepts of masculinity through the podcast in a few different ways. And I have been thinking about Pedro Pascal, like what is going on with Pedro Pascal, the concept, the phenomenon, right? And so, you know, I think that one of the pieces that I've really noticed about him, and it could partly just be my algorithm, but I feel like everything that I see on my Instagram and TikTok is like, Pedro Pascal's amazing. He's so hot. He's the internet's daddy. He's the internet's boyfriend. Everybody loves him. He's the ally. And I'm seeing a lot of this kind of, it feels to me like a lot of women who have been burned by men before have pulled Pedro Pascal forward as like the only good man in all of Sodom, as the story goes in the Bible, or the way that, Noah was. There's often in mythology, there's this story of like, if I can find one good man, if I can find one good person, I won't destroy the whole universe, right? And so I feel like Pedro Pascal is holding that right now. He's up on such a high pedestal that it feels like some of these folks would throw men out the window altogether, just like get rid of them, they're no good. But we have Pedro Pascal, who's a trans ally and a kind person and friends with his female, co-leads and whatever it is. So I found that narrative to be really fascinating around him.
I think it is really interesting. I mean, it does beg a lot of questions. I mean, like not only about like the nature of celebrity and how these people end up sort of on these pedestals and things like that, but what it is particularly about the ones who get to enjoy these kind of like this status as being somebody who is seemingly really broadly well liked and respected across like large swaths of the population. And I mean, of course, like then the reaction. We live in such reactionary times that, what we're seeing, in little nooks and crannies of the internet about like this backlash against kind of thing is seemingly always going to be inevitable. We seemingly love the great man and then the fall. I mean, you and I both were raised in our formative years in the late 90s and early 2000s. We've watched pop stars like Britney Spears get, raised up on a pedestal and then torn to pieces, and all of these cycles of this kind of thing. And I'm actually really interested to delve deeper into this, because there are a lot of interesting components of who he is and the work that he's chosen to do and those kind of things that I think do make him an interesting character study, and an interesting study for like, is he a really like good archetype for like what modern masculinity ought to be? And so and in that way it's very unsurprising that like figures from the right are trying to find ways to pick at it, because this is a masculinity that they are reactionarily opposed to. But I mean, yeah, it's an interesting figure. And I mean, I come at it from a different angle. I mean, like I'm like painfully cishet. And so like for me, like he's not interesting to me as like an attractive leading man, but he's like, and yet he still is interesting and appealing and all of those things, without me being like, particularly smitten with him like as a man.
Yeah, I feel like he came into my my orbit through The Last of Us, and I think The Last of Us is interesting in the context of this conversation because he plays a father figure in that show, and it's this post-apocalyptic, zombie. There's lots you can say about Last of Us, but he in that show, he is very much an archetypally masculine man, in the sense of he's protector, provider, these sort of classic ideas of what a man should be, but on an extremely violent level, like so violent that, my husband wouldn't let me watch the last episode of the first season, because he had to kind of vet it for me to see, and he was like, don't, I'll tell you what happened, but like, you don't need to see this part, because I'm quite sensitive to that stuff, and I wanted to know what was going to happen with the story. But the extremity of the violence is very intense in that show. And so I've been curious if part of the reason he can be this alternative archetype of masculinity in his celebrity is because, he can be soft and he can be kind and he can have anxiety, he can be like an example of someone who has a mental illness that's relatable, because he has held these really masculine roles in Last of Us. And also, I haven't seen all of these, but Game of Thrones, Narcos, The Mandalorian, they're often these very violent, highly masculinized, masculine archetype kind of characters. Is that what allows him to have the freedom to be the only good man in Sodom, or whatever it is, to be the saving grace of masculinity in the post-Me Too era, where as you said, we've witnessed so many of these massive falls of celebrity, like Britney Spears and so on. But then within the Me Too context, there's also, you know, these men who, oh, this guy that you've been following for a long time and you thought was a good guy, turns out he's extremely evil, and he's, you know, it's heartbreaking. Like, a lot of us have been through that many times before. And so, you know, Pedro Pascal is being held in that moment right now, and I have been feeling quite nervous for him for that reason. Just that, ooh, if he's that high up, he's going to get kicked down, and how bad is it going to be? Like, we've been burned by that before, right?
Totally. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, you pointed me in the direction of a book that I'm really interested in digging deeper into, which was BoyMom, and Ruth Whippman, I think her name was, her work on this. And I really liked her use of the term impossible masculinity.
Me too, yeah.
And it does, as you dig into and you watch and you see him interviewed and things like that, he does seem to straddle, like, in a way, like, you know, to oversimplify it, like the archetypal kind of like walking those lines that kind of represents what, like, you know, she would define as like the impossible masculinity, which is to be both hard and soft, to be both, like, you know, vulnerable but, you know, restrained, and all of these kind of like this nuance that seems to be articulated in various ways, but, you know, very difficult to cobble together as we try to define like what modern masculinity is. I first saw him in Game of Thrones, and where he played a philandering playboy as Oberyn Martell, who then, you know, met a very violent death. And but like, yeah, and then you know, Last of Us is like, you know, a tough Texan, I believe ex-service, you know, that kind of a role, and so I do wonder whether or not, like, by doing that, like, it gives him a pass with the people who still expect traditional masculinity. And so they're like, oh yeah, Pedro ticks those boxes, I'm comfortable with Pedro, he can be all of these other things, but it, like, you know, I like him because he was, you know, because he was tough in Last of Us, and I recognize that archetype of masculinity, and so I don't, you know, I just don't mess with the other stuff, but it's like, but Pedro's good because he did that, and he's, you know, in Star Wars.
Yeah, so that book I heard about on an episode of Jon Favreau's podcast Offline, and that interview with Ruth Whippman was so, it was like quenching a thirst, I think, for me, that I had. You know, she talks about a lot of really interesting things, that concept of impossible masculinity. You know, there are a couple pieces in that interview that really have stuck with me, but one part is this idea that men should sit down and shut up, right? Like, let other people step forward and talk, but also silence is complicity. Yes. So if you're not speaking exactly the right things, then you're a villain anyway. So I feel like a lot of men feel like masculinity is impossible, right? It's like, how do I do this? And she also said something that I related to so much, which is that as a feminist, it can be really hard to talk about these things because you don't want to sort of speak forward to men and masculinity, and then people assume that you're, you know, on the right or in the manosphere, or like on the side of the incels or whatever it is. You know, I feel for myself very strongly feminist, but that has, I think, almost always included men, right? Like the idea that patriarchy harms everyone. It's not that men are the patriarchy and they're the ones that need to be, you know, made to shut up and sit down or whatever. It's that, like, let's look at how patriarchy affects all genders, you know, forcing that gender binary and then making men fit into these tiny little boxes that I feel like they must just feel so constricting, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I totally agree. I mean, I was working on I had this idea that had been bouncing around in my head, and how the right had co-opted the language of freedom. And one of the places where I inevitably landed was masculinity and patriarchy. And I mean, like, you know, I perhaps lack the nuance to fully differentiate what is patriarchy versus masculinity, if, you know, masculinity is just the expression of manhood under patriarchy or whatever. But I mean, the truth is, like, as a man, and I think that this is where a lot of the tension that we're seeing right now, these unresolved tensions that we all feel, but without being able to give it voice, and without being able to identify what they are, they just remain these unresolved, nagging, societal voices in the back of their heads. I mean, there's like there's a line in a Tragically Hip song that like even babies raised by wolves know the fact that they've been used. It's like, I feel like this is an under thread that runs under all of it. And so some of that is capitalism, but like for men, I think part of it is this like the liberation of women has meant that women have through all the challenges and stuff like that, been allowed into so many new places and allowed to be so many new things from where they were and been allowed to occupy all of these spaces. But traditionally, like masculinity hasn't really moved that dial. It's like, simplistically, it's like, well, women can wear pants, women can work in construction, they are encouraged to be engineers and computer, designers and all of these things that they're encouraged to be now. And men still, like what is a traditionally tolerable man remains very narrow. Mm-hmm. And any departure from these things is seen as a major transgression. Right. And it's very hard to move outside of that, like individually, let's say. But the reasons are faceted. I mean, so much of, I think, what makes up modern masculinity is actually like a negative framing, which is that it's like modern masculinity is non-feminine.
Right.
And so it's like, well, as feminine has been this positive process of expanding and imagining the expanding role of what a woman is and what female beauty is or whatever all of these things are, masculinity remains this tiny thing. And so men still don't occupy caregiving roles and they're not seen as caregivers. I mean, and for me, that's really, really frustrating and annoying. I mean, so you and I talked about this, but my mom gave me what I think, and I've never taken a gender studies class. I'm going to profess my ignorance here in advance, is that her definition of feminism was all that feminism is the belief that women are people and are therefore entitled to all the rights that people enjoy. And right. For me, I found that to be both really useful and very effective actually as a parent. And it helps shape a view. But I mean, in that view, it's like women now are people and they're allowed to make choices. And it feels like men are choosing to not only grow and expand what it might look like to be a modern man, but in fact, then there's like this underlying frustration, this psychological thing where they're just, I guess, I don't know if it's because they feel crowded out or they're feeling this thing where like they're seeing women flourish, and by not flourishing, they're just like, there's this feeling that they can't reconcile that translates into this nastiness that we see sort of permeating our culture and this new misogyny, I mean, which is just the same as the old misogyny. It's just been right. More full-throated these days and seemingly more tolerable and found a broader audience again.
Yeah. So the guest I often have on here, Emily Nimitz, they're an old friend of mine, and we have talked a few times about the emotional privilege that women and people raised as women and so on tend to have, which is the idea that you can have a conversation about it, right? You can talk about it, you can complain about it. Mm-hmm. And it's often like women and other genders, but not cis-het men, right? Yeah. It's sort of like everyone but cis-het men are allowed to come into this space and like have a conversation. And these kind of consciousness raising groups started in the 60s, I think, around, all of the first wave feminist stuff. And it was a space where women could figure out with each other, like, what was happening and what it meant to be a woman and what kind of rights a woman wanted and so on. And, we're not saying that any of that is a bad thing. Like, that's wonderful and has been really helpful and powerful. And we're also not saying that men don't have privileges. Like, of course, men have privileges like tending to be heard, tending to be able to have a voice, there's still a wage gap, like all of those things are still true. Mm-hmm. And, the emotional privilege is essentially just that. It's a place where you can talk. And I think, for some men, even if you wanted to talk about it, it's like, how would I even begin? Or like, who would I talk to about that? And what I thought was so cool about Manology was, it was a men's group and it was so popular. Like, so many men showed up. Like, there was these huge rooms just filled with people, at the all gender sessions as well. Like, women would really show up and want to have these conversations as well. And I got the sense that there was like a longing, like a real yearning for men to be able to connect on that level. But where would they have encountered this before, right? Like, and I'm having some interesting times in my own family situation. I have 2 boys, and so of course this question of how to raise boys is a big question in my house, right? And my husband and I have had some very interesting conversations about, like, well, let's think about what our parents looked like and how they held gender roles and their parents before them. I do a lot of family system stuff in my therapy practice, and, you know, you often parent the way you were parented by default, right? Julie here, interrupting real quick just to let you know that I appreciate your support, and you're already supporting the show just by listening. And if you want to send some direct support, this podcast is just me. It's just me organizing, recording, editing, producing, all of that stuff. And it would be really wonderful if you wanted to send a little tip, a little offering my way. So you can go to juliepeters.ca/tip me. It'll take you to PayPal, where you can put in any amount you like. And if you want to tip me $50 or above, I will send you a personalized tarot reading just for you. And you can send me a question if you want to around that. So juliepeters.ca/tip me. Back to the show. And this idea that mothers especially should be sort of subsumed into motherhood is very intense. Like, I don't know if you The Giving Tree, is that one that you have read? Or
yes.
Yeah. So for those that don't know, the basic story is that there's a tree and a boy who loves the tree, and the tree gives the boy leaves to do something, and he goes and leaves and comes back and needs more, so she gives the branches, and then he leaves and comes back and he needs more, so she gives the bark, and so on, until she's a literal stump of her previous self, like a literal, stub of who she used to be, and he still sits on her stump, and that's how the story ends. And it's like, and that's love, like that's motherhood, that you should give absolutely everything you have until you are nothing, and that the person that you're giving to owes you nothing in return. And like, sort of like that, it can feel like that. I think especially with nursing, I find nursing just a bit of a mind fuck,
Sure.
Because it's like, I have this vampire, like I have this tiny vampire that's just, he's sucking my blood every 2 hours. Like, it's really, really intense.
It's a symbiote, not a parasite. So.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And he's growing to be able to partake of the rest of the world, right? Like it's that allows him to grow enough that he can reach out away from me, is kind of the point. But also as a model, I think especially in The Giving Tree, it's a boy, right? Like it's not a little girl that's asking for all this stuff. The tree is not masculine. The tree is a woman, like a female identified. So it's this kind of relationship between a woman or a mother and this boy who grows to be a man, and so on. And like, what a sort of dystopian model, I think, for motherhood, right? We will get back to Pedro Pascal eventually.
Yes, I was going to say, I feel bad that we immediately launched into this and left Pedro behind.
Yeah, we'll come back to him.
Yeah.
But I've been reading a book called The Body is a Doorway by Sophie Strand, and it's about her experience with chronic illness, among other things. And she's a very, very interesting thinker and writer. And there's a piece for me that's always been, maybe the best way to describe it is that I think with my whole body, or I experience the world with my whole body, not just my mind, right? So like pain that I feel or exhaustion, like the body is the instrument through which we experience the world, right? So she actually expands that out to the body in relationship with, the weeds, the wildfire smoke, the bugs that bite us, the illnesses that we contract. Like all of these things are a part of, we are in this web of everything, and that's sort of how we're connected. And so the reason I'm bringing that up is because I'm thinking about what you said around this idea of like the isolation that it can often feel like to be in the family structure, and this need to kind of go outside of that. I think there's something specifically about post-COVID where, I have these moments in my day-to-day life where I'm like, before COVID, did I worry about touching a door handle? Like, I can't remember, was I so aware? Like, I feel like I have this thing on my hand if I've touched a door handle, and like, it might be old germophobia, I don't know, but it's like, I kind of can't remember how my mind worked before that experience. And I think so many of us, like, we're not totally over that experience of global pandemic that, well, I feel like Last of Us, all of these movies that are about like pandemics, illnesses, the sort of zombie apocalypse thing, this idea that like, I remember in early COVID, this feeling of any other person is dangerous, right? Like anyone could be infected. Like in Last of Us, they call the zombies the infected, right? So it's this idea that people are being taken over and then you become vulnerable. And so you isolate, like you become more and more insular within yourself. And The Last of Us, I'm pretty sure anyway, that title is a reference to, it's just Joel and Ellie. Like it's just the two characters who are kind of moving through this apocalyptic world, and it's really them against the world. And they make friends and community and stuff, but so often, the people they meet die. There's just a lot of death and a lot of loss, and all of that stuff happening. So it becomes this very, very tightly isolated experience of fatherhood, really, I guess, in that show. So maybe this is segueing us back to this fatherhood archetype and what it can mean. And, I think that there's a piece that happens in Last of Us. And this is something that I have noticed in many films about not about masculinity, but like films that are more male coded. Like I remember the movie Wolverine that I saw a million years ago, but I thought it was so interesting in this way where a lot of the time in these movies and TV shows, men have to trade. Like they can only have connection at the cost of their literal lives.
Right.
Like so much of the time, these male characters will have to die if they maintain a meaningful connection. So in Wolverine, I couldn't tell you too much about the plot, but I do remember this piece of like, Wolverine had an attachment to a young girl. It was like this fatherhood kind of thing, and he ended up dying like for her. I think like he had to sort of sacrifice his life for her. Like the cost of his vulnerability as a father and as a man was that like, okay, well, your story has to end here. Like there's no way that you can continue on and be like a loving father, right? And so I'm gonna spoil Last of Us if anyone wants to fast forward like 30 seconds or whatever. But in the last season, there was this real tenderness that Joel, Pedro's character, was showing towards Ellie, Bella Ramsey's character. And there was this thing about his father being abusive towards him, and his father saying, I don't beat you the way my father beat me. Like, I'm just trying to do a little bit better than my father did, right? And then Joel is going through what he's going through with Ellie, and he says the same thing. Like, I know I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to do a little better than my dad did. And he becomes this really... I don't know, was he a perfect, example of fatherhood? As someone who, at one point in the show, he protects Ellie by killing literally something like 50 people. It's sort of like he kills like all these people in order to save her, which when you look at it, you're like, was that necessary? Like, could he not have had a conversation, to prevent this from like, I feel like there are other ways that could have gone. But maybe not from this archetypal perspective, right? Like maybe in order to be the ideal father that stands up for her in her queerness, he is there for her no matter how mad at him she is. He has all of these like wonderful qualities as a father that character couldn't literally survive, right? That he had to be killed off in the show because there's nothing after that, right? Like in movies and TV shows. So I know you haven't seen Last of Us, but even just thinking about like, I don't know, any movie or TV that has a male character, like how often do we see a father who's like a really, realistic representation of what a good father is surviving the show? Like, there
are a couple of other interesting pieces there because there are other elements that are interesting in both of those examples. The only way to kind of grow in this role as a father is in the absence of a mother figure.
Right.
Yes. As opposed to being a strong father figure in the presence of like also having a secondary parent. And in The Last of Us, it's the piece of also having to have gone through his own loss of his biological daughter. It's unclear whether or not, without having experienced that loss, if he could have become a fully formed father figure. It's like all of these pieces coming together, like arduously and painfully in order to give him the emotional space to become a parent. It's such an odd way to kind of like allow, an archetypal good father figure to come forth, as opposed to it being, I mean, you know, story and contrivances and plot and all of those things. But it is interesting, like, just the two examples that you gave, I was like, oh, but in both cases, it's like there has to be the absence of the mother in order for this to work. There has to, like, and it's sort of like, why is that? I mean, I'm sure there are examples of good family unit things and strong parental figures. I'm thinking maybe that, like, the John Krasinski movie with the where they have to be quiet. I think that's a fully formed like family unit there. But I mean,
and actually in that movie, I think he sacrifices himself for the family at the end too, doesn't he? I think he actually dies at the end of that the first Quiet Place. He's like distracts the monsters or whatever so that his family can get away. I think he also has to pay for his good fatherhood with his life.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. This is their version of the male giving tree. You don't get to be a stump. You get to be a tombstone.
You have to be annihilated. Yeah, you have to be annihilated. But that's impossible masculinity, right? And to come back to that idea of Pedro Pascal, like, I think it's really interesting that specifically people call him daddy.
Yes. And I'm very interested in your take, because daddy to me is kind of an alien concept. I mean, we don't have like a fully formed daddy kind of understanding about a figure like Pedro.
I mean, neither do I, to be fair. My friend Marcelle, she has a podcast called Material Girls, and it's kind of similar to this one. They have like really interesting takes on pop culture and movies and stuff like that. And I know that they were doing a live show in Vancouver that was on the concept of daddy. So it's not recorded yet. I haven't listened, but hopefully it'll come out at some point and I can hear her take, because I think she'll have more to say about this. But I think it is, like, what I'll say is what I think is interesting about it. So Pedro, as the internet's boyfriend, is 50, which is interesting. I recently watched the F1 movie, which is, I want to do a podcast about as well, because it holds a lot of these masculine archetypes in Brad Pitt as a lone wolf. And I think there is actually a moment in that movie where maybe he wouldn't have survived, but actually he doesn't choose connection. He continues to be the lone wolf. And so on.
It is interesting. I mean, like, and I wonder, like, because it's interesting because Pedro didn't, like, let's say, grow up in the limelight. Like, he was 41 when his career, sort of as we all recognize it. I mean, that's not entirely. But his career took off in, like, 2014 with Game of Thrones and a couple of other things. That was
like, he's been working a long time, but he hasn't been this famous. Yeah.
Yeah, he did 20 years of grinding through, like, network, being you know, a goth guy on NYPD Blue, or, like, all of these little bit parts and stuff like that. But it is interesting to sort of see, you know, that this older figure and to be out of the, you know, to not have that had to kind of grow up through that the grind of being younger in Hollywood. I wonder, like, and you know, at 50, is that just safe to people?
Right.
I mean, which Me Too would tell you is absolutely not true. But, like, when we look at the figures who fell in that thing, but it is like interesting. I mean, like, I've got lots, like, I've watched a few interviews with him and stuff like that, and it's really, the intangibles are hard to hold on to, but it is like, you know, he's, you know, masculine but allows himself to be silly. He's self-deprecating but seemingly, like, also aware of who he is and where he exists in the cultural zeitgeist. He's aware that he's, like, a handsome man and everybody loves him, but he's not self-serious about it. And so, like, you know, there is, like, safety in, I think, that kind of juxtaposition by being, like, you know, because he could be a very self-serious, like, you know, romantic lead type. But then, I mean, and then the choices, right, where, like, he's done all these serious roles. I mean, he's not doing, like, a Hugh Grant rom-com sort of part in his older career. But he's choosing to be masculine, but also silly. I mean, I think of, like, the movie he did with Nick Cage, where he's just, like, kind of very silly in a way. I do wonder, because his background is really interesting to me, as somebody who is, like, involved in progressive politics. And I wonder, you know, this attempt to backlash against him because of the way he interacts with his female co-stars, for example, which I think is really craven, and really there's nothing there. And anybody who actually, exists as a man and has real female friends is just like, this is nothing. This is only something to people who have only existed in an environment where like your only friends are people of your gender.
Right.
And it's like, and can't imagine friendships between sexes without having a romantic, entanglement as part of that. But like the fact that, he is very private. It's really, really weird to look at somebody and be like, I have no idea who you've ever been involved in a relationship with. And to be private in that way. And he's not over the top publicly political, although he has spoken out on trans rights, for example, which I think is really
the controversy is coming
which is why people started coming for him. And he did say something recently, sort of talking, I think, about the political zeitgeist in the States and things like that. But it makes total sense because, like his family was left wing, like they were on Pinochet's like enemies of the state list when Pinochet took over in Chile, and it's partially because they were left wing student activists at that time, but it's also, I didn't realize this, but his dad is actually an Allende, like a cousin to the socialist president of Chile. And so it's like, which is also, when you think about class and the interaction of class and how people are formed, that would suggest that, that his family certainly came from the upper class of society in Chile, and then, through becoming refugees essentially to the States, that would be a change in sort of like class. And I wonder the degree to which that transition potentially for their family in terms of status and things like that, like the impact that would have on a family, either like a humbling factor or those kind of things. And so it's a very interesting upbringing. But it leads me to the conclusion that like Pedro's probably just like legitimately in his bones progressive, and therefore sees women as people and is able to form real relationships. And I think that just bleeds through in the person that he is, and then the person that everybody gets to see. And by being comfortable enough to be authentic in public and letting kind of his values shine through, like I feel that there's something there. I'd be remiss if I didn't think that there was something to simply to that in terms of like what his appeal is.
Yeah, and looking into the controversy a little bit, it sounds like there were some people on the right that wanted to find something wrong with Pedro Pascal. And when I first heard that there was some controversy, I was like, oh God, here it comes. Like he's going to come tumbling down, which I don't think is happening. It could still, I suppose, but the original, or one of the original comments was that he doesn't grope men the way he does women that he's with. And actually, that's not true. There's lots of evidence of him being affectionate with his male co-stars and so on. Yeah. And, there's maybe a little bit of a racial piece there as well. Like this idea that from a sort of white perspective, the sort of white layer of masculinity in North America, or, however it is that you want to think about it, men are also very insulated, and their bodies, like that an ideal male masculine body would be highly sexual with women, and that there would be a lot of sexual contact with maybe multiple women, but that like loving affection with maybe anyone else would not be allowed, right? Like hugging like your dad or your friend or your brother or whatever it is, that like that's comes back to that whole like fear of feminization maybe, or like, oh, that means you're gay or something like that. There's a real tightness around white masculinity, I think, in a way that in a lot of other cultures, it's much more common for men to like hug or hold hands or sort of have like more affectionate greetings that are not coded as sexual at all. It's just like how you can kind of be in the world. And so, it doesn't surprise me too much that if the controversy or the criticism is coming from the anti-trans right, that it would also be the white supremacist right. Yeah. Either overtly or subversion, like on the sub layer. It's hard to ignore it. The multitude of reasons that somebody might choose to dislike somebody showing themselves in public in this way. Yeah. Yeah, because it seems to be a very healthy
like a really good version of like what masculinity ought to be,
right?
Which is, you know, sort of, you know, actually hitting many of those boxes of that sort of impossible masculinity, which is both being hard and soft and vulnerable and yet, you know, together and all of those pieces, but also like open about it. I mean, talking about anxiety and those kind of things, and talking about anxiety and specifically acting in a manner that I think is like unfortunately gender coded for women, which is when you're anxious, you reach out to people that you're close to and you talk to them about things.
Right.
And I say that as somebody who's also guilty of sometimes just being my own therapist, and like, and it's not normal. I mean, I was fortunate enough that a friend of mine who was going through some challenges reached out to me and was just like, I don't know how to find counseling in his area. His area is legitimately underserved. And I said, look, like, some of the things that you're saying sound similar to some of the things that I've gone through in my own relationships and things like that. And I would happily use my psychology background and my own personal experiences and the thing that I know about you and your partner to kind of like help you wrap your head around what it is that you're doing. And in fact, a lot of the things the most critical things that I felt like needed unpacking were actually gendered things.
Right.
Were about, you know, about friendships, about not having to be the only person for your spouse, allowing other people to serve other functions and to be okay with that and not to feel jealous when, you know, your partner isn't necessarily opening up to you and is choosing to open up to someone else in a way, and those kind of things, and, you know, to try and tease apart those kind of pieces and just be like, you know, and I think that some of that has been positive and worked and things like that, but it was clearly like a big reach for my friend, who was also just like a man and you know, very much like the same as I was raised, which is we you know, very waspy. We internalize our problems. We don't talk about
Same,
it.
Yeah.
We just get by. You know, in my house, you know, my mom and I, when I was a teenager, would yell and scream at each other, and then we would like wake up the next day as though nothing had happened. As though that is resolution and that is sufficient and those kind of things. And so, and so I think like here, having an archetype of masculinity that's like, you know, not only do I experience anxiety, at the height of my career, at the absolute stratosphere of my popularity probably, like, you know, I'm still insecure and whatever, but to like actually demonstrate really positive behavior in response to that and talk about it, I think is really positive.
And no surprise that there's the backlash around that, right? That feminine coded, that emotional privilege that we talked about before, that like it is so normal for a woman, I think, to, you know, if I'm having a bad day or whatever, like I'll talk to my husband, I'll text my friend, like I'll call someone, like I'll hang out with, I will process it verbally, you know, I'll talk about it for sure. And obviously I'm a therapist, so I've, you know, been trained in that way too. But for men, it's so different, right? It's so not expected that would be how one would deal with something. And then you have Pedro Pascal, saying that that's what he does, and then people being like, that's weird, I don't like that, like he must be creepy, you know, he must be a sexual predator if he's reaching out to maybe specifically women, I guess, or whoever it is, when he's having a mental health moment. You know, it's again, that's that tightness of masculinity, that really, really just rigid box that you have to fit into. So just to come back to this daddy concept a little bit more, and again, I'm sure there's more to say about this. I don't think I have all the answers here, but I think, again, that impossibility of him being the ideal father, because he plays an ideal father on TV. He is not a father in his life, right? I'm not sure if that's a goal for him or whatever it is, but as far as we know, there's that's not there. So he can be the ideal father because he isn't one, right? It's sort of like it's that impossibility that he's able to straddle those things again. And I don't know, the whole daddy thing is very interesting. I mean, I think it has something to do with like I feel sexually attracted to you, but also I feel safe with you or protected by you. I think that there are a lot of, I would assume anyway, it's mostly women who are coming forward with this Pedro Pascal adoration, with the sort of the worship coming through, and that idea of daddy, which is just such a weird concept. It's like such a weird one to think about.
Yeah.
But, maybe there is something around like, I don't know, we all have a father wound, I suppose. I mean, I'm actually even writing about this I'm writing a book about tarot right now, which is basically all archetypes, and the emperor represents the father and maybe the father wound, right? Like the emperor is the number 4, which is a box, it's like a very rigid kind of number symbolism. And the emperor is authoritative and in control and very rigid. Like he is very much like, this is where I am. And the history and mythology of the tarot goes back to like the Roman emperor, right? Which would often be very violent. Like the Roman emperors would often be beloved because they could like easily fight against other invading, groups or whatever it was. Like that would often be how they would gain their power and so on. And then even in the tarot story, the emperor is trumped by, other archetypes where, you can kind of learn like, okay, what are other ways that we can think about authority or power, and what could that look like? And I'm not sure that the tarot story resolves masculinity, but that's something that comes up there, right? Is that how could a father or daddy or whatever it is be all of those things at once? And maybe that concept itself is impossible, right? It's like daddy having a sexual connotation, a connotation of power, a connotation of money, all of these things, and also the literal expression of father being something very, very different from that, right?
Yeah, it's a weird, I wonder if it just is also like an expression of just like the absence of appealing male archetypes these days. Because, I think that the thing that people, like that men seem to get so angry about is like, is what I think is actually just the manifestation of women choosing to be like, no, I have like a lot of say in who I get to partner with, and you're just like horribly unappealing. And in the absence of like really appealing masculine figures, that you're like, this is like a man who ticks all these boxes and makes me feel safe, but also gives me that gives me those feelings. And so it's just like, this is sort of like what I want. This is a man that I desire, both for his like traditionally coded masculine traits, but also as a nurturer, as a caring person, somebody that I want to fuck and watch TV with, like just like those kind of like spaces that don't necessarily exist otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know that anyone knows what Pedro's anxiety is about, but I would be anxious if I were him in that position, just in that stratospheric pedestal. And, I keep thinking, too, about how that simple definition of feminism is the radical idea that women are people. Part of what we're talking about is the radical idea that men are people, right? And maybe that's a complicated thing to say, and there's more there because, of course, we live in a culture where men are by default, having rights, being able to vote, like being able to make money, have money, be in control of all of these things and so on. And yet there is a piece that, at least from this archetypal perspective, men have a harder time accessing. I think Ruth Whippman talks about this too, that you can have all of these things, but at the cost of connection, at the cost of intimacy, right? At the cost of being seen as a human being with flaws. I think it brings in this idea of the ick factor. I don't know if that's something you've come across, but that idea that like, a man usually specifically will give you the ick when he shows something human, right? Like when he doesn't, get the ball in the net, or when he like is clumsy, or, says the wrong thing, or whatever it is. It's just like, you're not, you're not holding the archetype, right? Like you're not holding the polished archetype. And so, Pedro as the internet's boyfriend, as the internet's daddy, et cetera, holding this impossible masculinity. Are we seeing him as a human being? I think there are some ways where he's expressing humanness that people can relate to and so on. But there's got to be a moment where he slips up in some way and shows some of the kind of vulnerability that we're not comfortable with, right? Those are those messy parts that you want to be able to be with your partner or your close friends with, or whatever it is. It's like the ugly parts. So I wonder if even Pedro Pascal is allowed to have that sort of deep intimacy where he is in a safe space where he can be the fullness of who he is, because he is held to be the archetype, right? He's held to be the archetype of all of these things that feel impossible.
Yeah, and I mean, just being that exposed. Like, I often, as we talk about gender and things like that, I'm often cognizant of how, as a man, I get to be invisible in a way that women never kind of get to be as we move around in the world and stuff like that. And I know because I am a man and I do all of the things, I am both the embodiment, but I'm aware of all of the things that I do as a man that I'm like, that I don't love about myself, but that are simply sort of facets of that. And I'm very conscious of the fact that if I had to walk around in a woman-looking body, that I would feel totally different in my interaction with the world. And I mean, and being a celebrity like Pedro Pascal, and just that visible, and particularly an understanding of the fact that these trajectories often don't end well for lots of people, and we know that there's something in either us or just in a subset of our society that waits for these people to fall. There's this jealousy about status and celebrity and things like that people really glory in the decline, and in seeing people who are up high brought low, right? I mean, it's an ancient story, and so I do hope that something positive comes of having a popular celebrity figure who does seem to embody really many of the best attributes of what it is to be a man, and including in the way that he presents himself. He presents himself in a way that is that while it is masculine, is very expressive, and his clothes are very flowy and sort of a showiness that is often not allowed or not comfortable for men. And I mean, I'm very aware of that. I wear a lot of muted colors, gray and blues and blacks and things like that. And so I would hope that, in my ongoing efforts, which I always have these little subversive conversations with other men, because I'm always trying out these ideas with people about do you see how patriarchy is a box? Do you see how limiting it is? Do you see how much it's how damaging it is to men, how it limits your potential and your freedom, and how it limits the way that you can interact with the world and your partners and your friends and all of those things? Do you not see what a trap it is? And the enemy is not women. It is not women doing this, although there are plenty of women who act as gatekeepers for patriarchy. But it is largely men policing men into this space of what it is to be a man. And so having archetypes that we can actually look at and be oh, if this frees people just a little bit more to be a little bit more of a whole person. And I mean, and the Ruth Whippman interview talked about this. We don't often think about masculinity as being this limiting factor, but it really is. And as a man who is raised painfully male, I feel it, and I feel the absence of particular aspects of that skill set, and I feel the absence of some of that freedom. And it's not that I necessarily want it, but because I've so internalized it, there's almost a wanting to want it. You know what I mean? It's I don't want to paint my nails, but I kind of wish I did want to. You know what I mean? Right. Just little aspects of that, just little things that we internalize as men that we don't see as being freedom limiting. And so when I see it in that broader conversation about our freedoms and how people don't seem to understand how capitalism isn't freedom. Capitalism is the oppressive force. And if you decide to abandon capitalism, then you're free to starve. And that's not a choice. That is the coercive force of the economic system under which we live. And the same is true of patriarchy, where it's just you can choose to be a different kind of man, but you are opening yourself up to all of these things: social isolation, the ostracization of your peers, with kids teasing and bullying and all of those things, which are still rampant. I'm shocked at, my son plays hockey. It's largely been a very, very positive space, ironically, because I didn't play hockey because my mom was just no way. This is a bad zone. I'm not gonna let you there. But I see things that I'm like, I was sure that this would die in the 90s, you know, where it's just like, I can't believe this is still around. You know, I can't believe that, like, oh, that's so gay is still a thing.
Is it?
And you're
oh,
just
God.
like, oh yeah. And just like, and just all kinds of silliness and stuff like that. But it's like, but I wish for more modeling of a different, more liberating version of masculinity.
Yeah, like in his impossibility, can Pedro Pascal just stretch the edges a little for the rest of us, right? And in our sort of support of Pedro Pascal and what he's doing or whatever it is, hoping he doesn't have a too horrifying fall, that none of that has to be mutually exclusive with other feminist, you know, needs and supporting, you know, all of us being people, all genders being people.
Yeah.
And maybe we extend that out to like the weeds and the animals and the flocks and the wildfires being people too, right? It's like, can we expand this all out?
Yeah.
And speaking of all of this, I know that you have a dad thing that you have to do right now.
Yes, we have kids in camps in different corners of the region and things like that. So
yeah, the dad school bus is about to leave. So, and again, I really appreciate you joining me for this conversation because there is so much, right? Like there's so much to think about, and it's really valuable to be able to have this conversation with you, like for my own reasons, but I think also to be able to share this conversation out, because I think some of these things are hard to talk about. Actually, they're hard to express and hard to, you know, think about and feel about and all that. So, I really appreciate you being here and having this chat with me.
Well, thanks for offering. This was lovely. It was great to have this conversation. I'm super happy to talk about this. I'm glad to have a platform for some of these ideas, and I hope it does stimulate people to think about things, even if they don't agree, because I feel like some of these things are just the negative elements of them are so insidious and help explain some of the things that are happening in a way. And I think that giving them at least sort of an understanding is a way that we can start to pick at them, because otherwise it just feels like things are sliding out of our control and out of our hands and in a way that those of us who want better for our daughters and our boys and all of these things and for everybody, we need to push back, and we need to have a positive version of this.
At least start having the conversation. And for sure.
Because otherwise there are lots of people who are waiting there to have different conversations that we don't want them to have.
Yep, that's so true.
With these people
that's so
too.
true.
So thank you for having me. It was a real treat.
So thank you so much, everyone, again, for listening to Popcorn Therapy with me, Julie Peters. And I would love to hear what you think. This is, for me, such a big and interesting conversation, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share this with a friend. If you would like to send a couple dollars to the show, that would be very much appreciated. You can go to juliepeters.ca/tipme and send the show, a couple bucks is great. If you want to send $50 or more, I'll send you a little personalized tarot reading just for you. So stay tuned for our next episodes. I'm hoping to get some more to you in the next little while. I've got some plans and looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.